every head turned. Except Amara's. Amara, still on her knees, still holding a piece of bread halfway to her mouth, hadn't even registered the sound. She was somewhere else in her mind. Somewhere far from this floor, this humiliation, this room full of people who watched and said nothing. "What?" said a voice that carried effortlessly across 200 feet of marble and silk. "Is going on here?" The voice belonged to a man in his late 30s. Dark suit, no tie, moving through the crowd with the unhurried confidence of someone who had never once had to raise his voice to be heard. Camille's face went through 3 expressions in under 2 seconds. Shock, panic, and then a desperate, plastered-on smile. "Daniel," she said, her voice climbing an octave. "You're early, we didn't expect." I asked what's going on. Daniel Ashford, heir to the Ashford Grand Hotel Group. The groom's older brother, and, though almost nobody in that ballroom knew this yet, the man who had quietly bought controlling interest in the hotel chain from his own father 18 months earlier, making him at 38, the actual owner of the building they were all standing in. He wasn't supposed to arrive until the reception's 2nd hour. He'd been delayed at the airport, flying back from a site inspection in Chicago, and he'd walked in through the service entrance because it was closer to the parking garage, the same corridor Amara had been working in all night. His eyes moved from Camille's tight smile, to the shattered glass on the floor, to the scattered food, and finally, to the woman kneeling in the middle of it all. Something in his face changed. "Ma'am," he said, and his voice dropped, gentler now, as he crossed the last few feet and crouched down in front of Amara, a billionaire in a $5,000 suit, kneeling on marble in front of 200 witnesses, at eye level with a maid. "Are you hurt?" Amara looked up at him, and for the first time all night, something in her chest cracked open, not from the humiliation, but from the sheer, disorienting shock of being seen. "No," she managed. "No, sir, I'm fine. What happened here?" His voice was quiet, but it carried the particular stillness of a man doing everything in his power not to raise it in public. Camille rushed forward. "Daniel, it was nothing. She spilled champagne on my dress and I was joking, it was a joke, everyone thought it was funny." "Was it funny?" Daniel didn't look at her. He looked at the bridesmaids, still holding their phones. He looked at the guests near the dessert table, several of whom had suddenly become extremely interested in their shoes. Did anyone in this room think this was funny? Silence answered him. He stood and offered Amara his hand. She hesitated. 11 months of instinct telling her that hands like his were not meant for hands like hers, but he didn't withdraw it, and finally she let him pull her to her feet. "What's your name?" he asked. "Amara," she said. "Amara Whitfield. Amara." He said it slowly, like he was making sure he'd remember it. Then he turned to the hotel's event manager, who had gone pale near the kitchen doors. "Get her a chair. Get her water. And get me the name of whoever assigned staff to work this event without proper break rotations, because clearly someone's judgment failed tonight, and it wasn't hers." "Daniel," Camille tried again, her voice tightening with the first real edge of fear. "She works for you. She's staff. You can't seriously be making this into a hole." "She works for me," Daniel repeated, and now, for the first time, he did look at her, directly, coldly, in a way that made the temperature of the room seem to drop 3 degrees. "Which means what just happened in my building to someone under my protection in front of my family. Do you understand what that means, Camille?" Camille did not answer. And that was when Daniel Ashford said the sentence that would end up, within 48 hours, on every gossip page in Boston. "I think," he said, turning back to Amara, "you and I need to have a conversation." "Not tonight. Tomorrow. My office, 10 a.m. There's something about you I think everyone in this room is about to find out, including you." Amara stared at him, utterly confused, utterly unprepared for what those words meant. She had no idea that the conversation waiting for her the next morning would change not just her life, but the life of every single person standing in that ballroom. Amara barely slept that night. She lay awake in her narrow bed, staring at the water stain shaped like Florida on her bedroom ceiling, replaying Daniel Ashford's words over and over. There's something about you. What could a billionaire hotel heir possibly know about her? She was nobody. A single mother from Dorchester with a GED, 2 jobs, and a son who deserved better than the life she'd been able to give him so far. She almost didn't go. It was Malik, eating cereal at their wobbly kitchen table the next morning, who convinced her. "Mom," he said with the blunt wisdom only 7-year-olds seem to possess. The man said 10 o'clock. "You should go. Maybe it's good news." You never get good news. So at 9:52 a.m., in her one nice blazer, Amara Whitfield sat in the lobby of Ashford Grand Hotel Group's downtown headquarters, hands folded tightly in her lap, watching executives in tailored suits move past her without a glance, the same invisibility she'd worn for years, except now it felt different. Now it felt like she was waiting for something to end. At 10 o'clock exactly, Daniel Ashford walked out to meet her personally. Not a secretary. Not an assistant. "Thank you for coming," he said, leading her into an office with windows overlooking the harbor. "I owe you an apology for last night. What happened to you should never have happened, and I intend to make sure the appropriate consequences follow. But that's not actually why I asked you here." Amara sat stiffly in the chair across from his desk. "Then why?" Daniel pulled a folder from his desk drawer and slid it across to her. "Because your name isn't just familiar to me from last night, Ms. Whitfield. It's familiar to me from something else entirely." Amara opened the folder with shaking hands. Inside was a photograph, old, slightly yellowed, of a man she hadn't seen in over 20 years. Her father. Standing beside a much younger version of a face she recognized instantly. Daniel's own father, Richard Ashford, arms slung around her father's shoulders like old friends. "Your father," Daniel said quietly, "was Thomas Whitfield. Am I right?" Amara's breath caught. "How do you know that name?" "Because 40 years ago, Thomas Whitfield co-founded the first Ashford Grand with my grandfather. 2 men, 1 lone. 1 hotel in a bad part of downtown Boston that nobody thought would survive its first winter." Daniel leaned forward. "Your father held 20% ownership of that founding company. When he died, you were what, 9? The paperwork got buried in a family dispute that lasted decades. My father bought out the disputed shares from a lawyer who, we now believe, never had the legal right to sell them. Because those shares were never his to sell, Ms. Whitfield. They were your mother's. And when she passed, they became yours." The room tilted slightly around Amara. That can't be right. My mother never said anything about a hotel. We had nothing. We lived in a shelter for 8 months when I was 11. Because someone made sure your family never found out what you were entitled to," Daniel said, and his jaw tightened in a way that told Amara this was not new information to him, that he had been sitting on this for longer than 1 wedding night. "I found the discrepancy in the company's founding documents 8 months ago, during an internal audit. I've spent that time trying to locate Thomas Whitfield's surviving family. I didn't know until last night that I'd already met her, that she was working in my own hotel, 6 floors below my office, and none of us had any idea." Amara pressed her palm against her mouth, tears rising before she could stop them. 22 years of scraping, of double shifts, of watching other children have things her son couldn't have, and the answer had been sitting in a filing cabinet the entire time. "So what does this mean?" she whispered. Daniel closed the folder gently. "It means, Ms. Whitfield, that as of this morning, our legal team estimates you hold somewhere around 11% equity in Ashford Grand Hotel Group, which, depending on how the courts finalize the transfer, makes you, conservatively, worth around $40 million. Amara didn't say anything at all. She simply sat there, in the chair across from the man whose fiancé had made her eat off a floor 18 hours earlier, and let the weight of an entire lifetime crack open at once. The next 6 weeks moved like a fever dream. Lawyers, depositions, A court hearing that made front-page news in the Boston business section. Hotel maid revealed as heir to Ashford fortune. Camille's engagement to Daniel's brother, already strained by the wedding night scandal that had gone viral within days. Clips of her forcing a woman to eat off a marble floor had spread across every platform imaginable. Her face frozen in cruelty for millions of strangers to judge. Quietly, then very publicly, fell apart. The Whitmore-Hale family's carefully built social standing cracked under a hashtag that trended for 9 straight days. #Justice for Amara. But Amara didn't care about any of that. She cared about the moment, 3 weeks into the legal process, when her lawyer called to confirm the first settlement transfer had cleared, and she sat on her kitchen floor in Dorchester and cried until Malik came and sat next to her, worried, asking if she was hurt. "No, baby," she told him, pulling him into her lap the way she used to when he was small enough to fit there entirely. For the first time in a really long time, nothing is hurting. She didn't quit her job right away. That surprised everyone. The lawyers, the reporters camping outside her building, even Daniel Ashford himself, who called her personally to ask if she needed anything. "I want to finish the season," she told him. "I want to walk out of that hotel because I chose to, not because I ran." He respected that. More than that, 3 weeks later, he showed up at the Ashford Grand staff entrance, the same corridor she'd been humiliated in, and asked if he could speak with her during her break. "I want to offer you something," he said, standing in the same hallway where he'd first found her on her knees. "Not because of the shares. Not because of any of that. I've watched how you've handled this. The dignity, the way you've treated every single person who's tried to take advantage of the story, the way you kept showing up to work when you didn't have to. I think you'd be extraordinary running our new community initiative, a program to fund hospitality training and housing assistance for hotel staff across the whole company. People like you were 6 weeks ago. People nobody sees." Amara studied his face for a long moment. "You're offering me a job." "I'm offering you a purpose," Daniel corrected. "The money will change your life, Ms. Whitfield. But purpose is what makes a life worth living. I think you already know that better than almost anyone I've ever met." She said yes before she'd even finished thinking it through. What Amara didn't know, what nobody in that moment could have predicted, was that saying yes to that offer would put her in an office 3 doors down from Daniel's for the next 18 months, working side by side on a program that would eventually house 400 hospitality workers and put career training scholarships into the hands of 2,000 more. And somewhere in those 18 months, something neither of them expected began, quietly, to grow. But that part of the story, the part about second chances, about a billionaire who learned humility from a maid instead of the other way around, is a story for another day. Tonight's story isn't a love story. It's a story about dignity. 6 months after that wedding night, Amara Whitfield stood at a podium in the very ballroom where she had once knelt on cold marble, except now the floor beneath her feet belonged in part to her. The Ashford Grand had rebranded the East Ballroom for a new annual event, the Whitfield Fellowship, a scholarship and housing fund named, at the insistence of the entire Ashford board after her. 200 hospitality workers from across the company's 41 properties sat in the audience that night. Housekeepers, servers, valets, laundry staff, the kind of people who, 6 months earlier, would have been invisible in that room the way she once was. She looked out at their faces and thought of every night she'd gone home too exhausted to help Malik with his homework. Every eviction notice she'd hidden in a drawer. Every time she'd swallowed her pride because pride was a luxury she couldn't afford. "I'm not going to pretend I have some grand wisdom to give you tonight," she began, her voice steady despite the tremor she felt in her hands. 6 months ago, I was on my knees on this exact floor, and someone made me eat food off the ground in front of 200 people because she decided my dignity was worth less than the hem of her dress. The room went silent, the good kind of silent, the kind that happens when people are truly listening. "I want to tell you something I've learned since then. Money didn't give me my dignity back. It never took it away in the first place. Nobody can take your dignity by humiliating you. They can only reveal their own. What changed for me that night wasn't what happened on the floor. It was what happened after, When someone finally saw me. Not because he found out I might be worth millions. Because he looked at a woman on her knees and thought, first, before anything else. Is she okay? She paused, scanning the crowd until she found Malik in the front row, 9 years old now, sitting tall in a small suit he'd insisted on wearing. That's what this fellowship is for. Not charity. Not guilt money. It's for making sure that the next time someone in this industry is knocked down, there's a floor beneath them sturdy enough to help them stand back up. A scholarship, a housing deposit, a person who says, "I see you," before anyone else in the room does. The applause that followed lasted nearly a full minute. But the twist of the evening, the one that made the local news the next day, came afterward during the reception, when a woman approached Amara nervously near the dessert table. It took Amara a moment to recognize her, one of Camille's bridesmaids, the one who had giggled loudest that night, phone raised, laughing along with the cruelty instead of stopping it. "I wanted to apologize," the woman said, voice shaking. "I've thought about that night every single day since. I should have said something. I should have stopped it. I'm ashamed I didn't." Amara studied her for a long moment, long enough that the woman visibly braced for rejection. "Thank you for saying that," Amara finally said. "It takes courage to admit you were part of something wrong. That matters more than you think." She glanced toward the small table of hors d'oeuvres nearby, the echo of that night impossible to ignore, and offered the woman something she hadn't expected, a genuine if measured smile. "The application for the Whitfield Fellowship's Community Volunteer Program opens next month. If you're serious about making it right, that's a good place to start." It wasn't forgiveness exactly. But it was something better. A door left open instead of one slammed shut. Camille Whitmore-Hale did not disappear quietly. For a few months after the scandal broke, she tried everything a wealthy family with wounded pride typically tries. A carefully worded public apology written by a crisis PR firm, a tearful sit-down interview on a morning talk show where she called the incident, "a moment I deeply regret," without ever quite using the word sorry to Amara's face, a quiet campaign among old family friends to paint the whole thing as overblown and taken out of context by the internet. None of it worked. The video was too clear. 200 witnesses had watched it happen in person, and dozens of them had their own phones out too. There was no context that made a grown woman forcing another human being to eat off a floor sound like anything other than exactly what it was. Her engagement to Daniel's brother, Nathaniel, ended formally 3 months after the wedding that never was. Nathaniel, to his credit, had been quietly horrified by his fiancée's behavior that night and had spent weeks trying to make it right before finally admitting the relationship couldn't survive what it revealed about her character. The Whitmore-Hale shipping business, publicly embarrassed, lost 2 major contracts within the year. Contracts that had, awkwardly, once relied on the Ashford family's goodwill. Amara felt no satisfaction watching any of it unfold. If anything, she felt something closer to sadness, the particular sadness of watching someone destroy their own life through cruelty they could have simply chosen not to commit. It was nearly a year later, at a charity gala neither of them had expected to attend, that Amara and Camille crossed paths again. Camille looked different, smaller somehow, stripped of the practiced confidence that had once filled a room like perfume. She approached Amara near the coat check, visibly working up the nerve. "I don't expect you to accept this," Camille said, her voice unsteady in a way Amara had never heard from her before. "But I need to say it anyway. I was cruel to you because I was insecure and I had never once in my life been told no. And somewhere along the way I decided that made other people's pain less real than mine. That's not an excuse. It's just the truth. I'm sorry, Amara. Truly. Not because of what it cost me. Because of what it should never have cost you." Amara studied her for a long moment, the same measured, careful look she'd given the bridesmaid months earlier. "Do you know what the strangest part of that night was?" Amara said finally. "It wasn't you. Cruelty like that doesn't surprise me anymore. I grew up around plenty of it. The strangest part was the silence. 200 people. And not one of them said a word until Daniel walked through that door. That's the part one think about most. Not what you did. What everyone else didn't do. Camille's eyes filled with tears. I don't know how to fix that. You don't fix it, Amara said gently. You just make sure you're never part of the silence again. That's the only apology that actually means anything. She didn't offer Camille friendship. She didn't offer forgiveness wrapped in a bow. But she offered her something honest, and in a strange way, that honesty was its own kind of grace. The kind that doesn't erase what happened, but leaves room for what could still change. By the time the second year of the Whitfield Fellowship rolled around, Amara's life bore almost no resemblance to the one she'd lived before that wedding night. And yet, somehow, the parts of her that mattered most hadn't changed at all. She still packed Malik's lunch herself every morning, even though she could have hired someone to do it. She still drove her own car, a modest sedan she'd bought second-hand years earlier, even though a fleet of company vehicles was technically available to her now. She still remembered with painful clarity what it felt like to be invisible, and she built that memory into everything she touched. The fellowship had grown faster than anyone predicted. What started as a housing and scholarship fund for Ashford Grand employees had expanded, at Amara's insistence, into a broader initiative, partnering with 3 other major hotel chains to create an industry-wide standard for staff protections, mental health resources, and emergency assistance funds. Reporters had started calling it the Whitfield Standard. Amara hated the name, privately telling Daniel it made her sound like a museum exhibit, but she let it stick because it made the work spread faster, and the work was what mattered. It was during a quiet evening at the office, long after most of the building had emptied out, that Daniel found her still at her desk, reviewing a stack of scholarship applications by lamplight. You know you don't have to review every single one personally, he said, leaning in the doorway. I know, Amara said, not looking up. But every name in this stack used to be a name nobody bothered to learn. I'm not going to be the person who stops learning them just because I got busy. Daniel crossed the room and sat on the edge of her desk, the way he'd started doing over the past year. A small, familiar gesture that had become its own quiet language between them. Can I tell you something I've never said out loud? Amara finally looked up. Always. That night at the wedding, before I even knew who you were, before any of the paperwork, before any of it, I couldn't stop thinking about you. Not because of what happened to you. Because of how you handled it. You didn't scream. You didn't beg. You just endured it with more grace than anyone in that entire room, including me, deserved to witness. I've thought about that a lot this past year. About what it says about a person, to hold on to their dignity even when someone's trying their hardest to strip it away. Amara set down the application in her hand. I wasn't being graceful, Daniel. I was terrified. I had a son at home and rent due and no safety net if I lost that job. That wasn't strength. That was survival. Maybe, Daniel said quietly. Or maybe surviving with your dignity intact when you have every reason to lose it. That is strength. I think we just call it different things depending on how comfortable we are watching someone else go through it. They sat in the quiet office for a long moment, the city lights spread out beyond the window, neither one quite ready to name what had been growing steadily between them for a year. Something built not on the money, not on the scandal, not even on the rescue of that first night, but on something slower and more durable. The simple, accumulating evidence of who a person is when nobody's forcing them to prove it. Malik asked me last week, Amara said eventually, breaking the silence with a small, careful smile. Why you come by the house so often now? Daniel's brow lifted. What did you tell him? I told him I didn't know yet. She met his eyes. Do you know? I think, Daniel said slowly. I've known for a while. I was just waiting until you were ready to hear it. The proposal, when it finally came, happened nowhere near a ballroom. It happened on a Tuesday evening in the small kitchen of Amara's Dorchester apartment, the same apartment she'd kept, even after the settlement, even after the job offer, even after everyone in her life gently suggested she could afford somewhere grander. She'd stayed because Malik's school was 3 blocks away and his best friend lived across the street, and because some part of her still needed to remember where she came from every single day, in the smell of the hallway and the creak of the 3rd stair. Daniel had come over for what was supposed to be a simple dinner. Pasta, garlic bread, Malik narrating an elaborate Lego battle at the table while the adults talked. It was, by any measure, an unremarkable evening, which was exactly why it felt right. After Malik had gone to bed, Daniel found Amara at the sink, washing the last of the dishes, and he simply stood there for a moment, watching her the way he'd learned to over the past year. Quietly, patiently, the way you watch something you've come to understand is rare. "I don't have a ring in my pocket," he said finally, "because I wanted to ask you something first before any of that." Amara turned, drying her hands on a dish towel, curious. "I need you to know," Daniel said, "that whatever you decide, none of what we've built together changes. The fellowship, the work, all of it, that continues regardless of what happens between us personally. I don't ever want you to feel like there's a transaction buried in this. I've watched too many people in my world treat love like it's another negotiation, and I refuse to let that be us." "Okay," Amara said softly. "So what are you asking?" "I'm asking," Daniel said, "if you'd let me spend the rest of my life making sure you never have to wonder, ever again, whether anyone truly sees you. 'Cause I do. I saw you that first night, on your knees on a floor that should never have asked that of you, and I've been seeing you clearer every single day since. Marry me, Amara. Not because of the money, not because of the story the papers love to tell. Because of exactly who you are when nobody's watching." Amara set the dish towel down slowly, her eyes bright with tears she didn't try to hide. "You know what the funny thing is," she said, her voice thick. "A year ago, I thought the worst night of my life happened in that ballroom. I thought I'd carry that humiliation forever, that it would define me no matter what came after." She stepped closer, taking his hands in hers. "But I don't think about that night anymore, Daniel. Not really. When I think about that ballroom now, I think about the moment the doors opened. I think about a man who knelt down on the same floor I was kneeling on, just to ask if I was okay." "Is that a yes?" Daniel asked, a smile breaking across his face. "That's a yes," Amara said, laughing through her tears. "That's absolutely, completely a yes." From the hallway, a small voice piped up. Malik, who had clearly not gone to sleep at all, standing in his pajamas with a triumphant grin. "Does this mean I get to be the ring bearer? I already picked out my suit." They were married the following spring, in a ceremony that could not have looked more different from the wedding that started it all. There was no $5,000 gown, no orchestra behind silk curtains, no guest list built entirely from society pages. Amara wore a simple ivory dress she'd chosen herself, and the ceremony took place not in the grand ballroom of the Ashford Grand, but in a community center in Dorchester, the same neighborhood where she'd raised Malik alone, where she'd once hidden eviction notices in a kitchen drawer, where every face in the crowd was someone who had actually known her before any of this began. The guest list read like a quiet rebellion against everything that ballroom had represented a year and a half earlier. Hotel housekeepers sat beside hospitality workers who'd received scholarships through the fellowship. Malik's teacher was there, along with the neighbor who'd watched him after school for years when Amara worked double shifts. Daniel's parents attended too, along with his brother Nathaniel, who had, in the time since his broken engagement, become one of the fellowship's most dedicated volunteers. Proof, Amara often said, that people really could change when they were willing to look honestly at their own silence. There was one more guest that day, one that surprised almost everyone present. Camille arrived quietly, seated in the back, dressed modestly, asking for nothing, Not a seat of honor, not recognition, not forgiveness performed for an audience. She simply came to witness and to offer in her own small way the kind of humility that had been entirely absent from her the last time she'd stood in a room with Amara. Amara had invited her herself. Why? Daniel had asked, genuinely curious, when Amara told him about the invitation. Because the story people love to tell is the one where the villain gets destroyed and the hero rises, Amara said. But that's not actually the story I want to tell. I want to tell the story where someone hurts you, and instead of spending your whole life needing them to suffer for it, you get to choose something better. Not because they deserve it. Because I deserve to be the kind of person who isn't ruled by what was done to me. At the reception, held in the same community center's modest banquet hall, no crystal chandeliers, just string lights and folding tables and food that Amara had helped choose herself, Daniel stood to give a toast. He didn't talk about the fellowship or the company, or the scandal that had made their names briefly, uncomfortably famous. "A year and a half ago," he said, raising his glass, "I walked through a door and found the woman I love on her knees on a marble floor, made to believe, for one terrible moment, that her worth was something other people got to decide. I've spent every day since trying to make sure she never has to wonder that again. But the truth is, she taught me more about dignity, about grace, about what it means to hold on to yourself when the world tries to take it away, than I ever managed to teach her about anything at all." He looked at Amara, standing beside him in her simple ivory dress, Malik gripping her hand tightly, beaming. "To Amara," he said, "who reminded an entire ballroom, and honestly an entire city, that the floor you're kneeling on has nothing to do with how high you're capable of standing." 2 years after that wedding night, the Ashford Grand's East Ballroom hosted its annual Whitfield Fellowship Gala once more, and this time Amara didn't walk to the podium as a survivor recounting what had happened to her. She walked up as a leader, standing beside a photograph projected on the wall behind her. A simple black and white image of her father, Thomas Whitfield, standing in front of the very first Ashford Grand, decades before any of this began. "My father believed something simple," she told the room, Daniel and Malik seated in the front row, Camille quietly present near the back, hundreds of hospitality workers filling the seats between them. "He believed that the people who build a place, the ones who clean it, who staff it, who keep it running while everyone else enjoys it, deserve to share in what it becomes. That belief got buried for 22 years. It took a stranger's cruelty, and then a stranger's kindness to dig it back up." She paused, letting the room settle into silence. "I used to think the worst moment of my life happened on this exact floor. Now I understand something different. That moment didn't define me. What I chose to build after it, that's what defines me. And I hope, for every single person in this room who has ever felt invisible, who has ever been made to feel small by someone who mistook cruelty for power, I hope you understand that the floor you're standing on tonight was built, in part, by people who refused to let one terrible night be the end of their story." The applause rose slowly, then all at once, filling the same ballroom that had once gone silent while she knelt on marble and ate off the ground. "If there's one thing I hope you carry with you from this story tonight, it's this: dignity was never something anyone else had the power to take from Amara. It only ever looked that way for one terrible moment in one terrible room. What actually happened, what always happens if we're patient enough to watch it unfold, is that cruelty reveals the smallness of the person committing it, and grace reveals the size of the person enduring it. The floor doesn't decide who you are. What you choose to build after you stand back up, that's the only thing that ever really does." If this story moved you tonight, I'd love for you to hit that like button. It genuinely helps stories like this reach more people who need to hear them. Subscribe to the channel if you want more stories like this one, real, emotional, human stories about dignity, resilience, and second chances. And if you know someone who needs to hear tonight's message, someone who's ever felt invisible, ever felt small, ever needed reminding that their worth was never anyone else's to decide, please share this with them. Thank you for staying with me tonight. I'll see you in the next story.